Well, it's 11 o'clock, so I suppose we should get started. I'll try to finish up by 11:45. No promises. Depends on how many tangents I get off on. I want to bring in a couple of modern day examples today, so we'll see how it goes. This is the second session of Prophets and Politics. Last week was the introduction to the class, and I talked a little bit about what is a prophet. Pastor Colleen gave you a recap today during the service, so I don't have to do that. She talked about what is a prophet. Prophet is not a fortune teller, but someone who comments on current events in terms of the future. So today, we want to look into the prophetic community of Moses. We'll talk about the community that Moses assembled in terms of the prophet's job of criticizing and energizing, what he did to form that community. The main resource I'm using for this series of classes, other than the Bible itself, of course, is the book, The Prophetic Imagination by Walter Brueggemann. Brueggemann passed away earlier this year. I had already planned to do this class, but his passing jogged my memory, and it reminded me that I had read this book some time ago. This book was originally published in 1978, and the second edition was published in 2001, and I read it just a couple of years after that. And I remembered that, and I reread it then earlier this year, and I thought, oh gosh, I've got to use this for this class because it's a wonderful book. He's a very dense writer, but of course, my job as a teacher is, did you have a question?
Title again?
Pardon?
Title again?
Title, The Prophetic Imagination by Walter Brueggemann. He's a very dense writer, but my job as an instructor is to put it into layman's terms, I guess you would say. So that's what I'm going to do. And I'll bring in, of course, a lot of scripture, because that's what we do around here. Then in the following sessions, next week I'll talk about Jeremiah and Isaiah, two of the Hebrew prophets, again in terms of criticizing and energizing. Jeremiah was especially adept at criticizing, bringing down the royal consciousness, the imperial empire. And Isaiah, especially second Isaiah, the book of Isaiah was written by at least three people. The middle section, chapters 40 through 55, sometimes called second Isaiah, was a great writing of hope for the Jews who were taken into captivity by the Babylonians, and Isaiah was encouraging them to return after King Cyrus of Persia issued an edict that the Jews could go home from Babylonia and return to their homeland. Isaiah wrote words of hope, encouraging the Jews to return. Most of the Jews in Babylonia had been born there. I mean, it was 60 years. Most of the people that originally were taken into captivity had passed away after 60 years. Most of the, except maybe those who were too young to remember their homeland were still alive. But so Isaiah was encouraging the people to return and rebuild. So we'll talk about that next week, October 5th. Now, we're going to be outside, if weather permitting. It's going to be a sanctuary of the first service, so if we're outside, make sure you come back in here. We always have a problem with that. The people, when we're outside, the temptation is to get right in our cars and go home. Resist the temptation. Come back in here for the class. Then after that, we'll get into Jesus of Nazareth, who was, of course, much more than a prophet, but he was a prophet. We'll again talk about criticizing and energizing, but in terms of pathos and amazement, the pathos of suffering and death and the amazement of resurrection and ascension. Last session on October 19th, well, what about us? How do we engage? And I'll talk about prophetic ministry as we go along, but the last session will be especially about prophetic ministry. Brueggemann in his book mentions, 10, 12 examples, current examples of prophetic ministry that he has encountered in our country. And of course, we're doing prophetic ministry here, of course. We can point to specific examples, but I would encourage us to think of everything we do here as a part of one prophetic ministry, supporting our prophetic ministry, whether it's work on climate change and removing invasive species in back, or council meetings, or cleaning up after events, or all of that is in support of our one prophetic ministry. But that's for October 19th. The alternative community of Moses. Oh, here's Brueggemann's book, if you want to know what it looks like, the prophetic imagination. This was a radical social break from Pharaoh's Egypt. This is nothing like they had experienced. It's estimated that the people of Israel were in Egypt for about 400 years. The emergence of Israel from Egypt cannot, as a community, cannot be extrapolated from any earlier reality. Their experience in Egypt was unlike their experience after Egypt. Where did Moses come up with his ideas? It's a mystery unless it was directly from God. That new social reality implies revelation, to put it a different way. So this new call from God brought forth the community of Israel. The way Brueggemann puts it, prophecy is born when the emergence of social political reality has a theological cause. It takes both social and theological effects. Brueggemann says, theological cause without social political reality may be of interest to a theologian. It's rather specialized. On the other hand, social political reality without theological cause may be of interest to a sociologist, very specialized interest. But when brought together in an event like the Exodus, they require us to speak of the call of the prophetic. Theology meets social political reality. So here, this is going to take some explanation. Breaking with triumphalism and oppression. I'll give a current example here to maybe explain this a little bit better. Here we're talking about this, in this break, the alternative religion of the freedom of God. You see, the gods of Egypt were, to put it one way, the gods of Egypt were not free. Well, they weren't gods at all, of course, fake gods, constructed entirely out of human minds. But they served a purpose. They served the empire. They served the Pharaoh. They were prisoners of the empire. People served those gods. The gods didn't serve the people. They served no purpose as far as the people were concerned, but they certainly served the empire. But the Exodus was a break from that religion of static triumphalism. The gods of Egypt were the immovable gods of order. They were static gods, not dynamic gods. The functioning of that society testified to the rightness of the religion. Kings did prosper, the bricks got made, and if there had been trains at that time, the trains would have run on time. That religion was the right religion for that empire. I guess to use a contemporary example, let me borrow, to turn this into a contemporary example, I have to make a word change. Not everybody today believes in God or believes in a God, or at least they claim not to. So I'm going to take a cue from a 20th century theologian named Paul Tillich. In his work Systematic Theology, he avoids using the word God. Instead, he uses the phrase, one's ultimate concern. Because there are people who claim not to believe in God, but everyone has an ultimate concern. For example, even if people don't believe in God, they may have an ultimate concern of their family's financial situation. How am I going to feed my family? What do I do to put food on the table? Now, empire can use that concern. The tyrant can take advantage of that fear, that financial fear. The tyrant can say, well, on day one, I'm going to lower prices. Right? So maybe one's ultimate concern is personal safety or the safety of my family. And the tyrant can say, I'm going to shut off the flood of murderers and rapists pouring over our open borders. Wouldn't you be much more comfortable with the static triumphalism of a great America? See, that's an example of static triumphalism. You kind of get what that means now, placed in modern terms, static triumphalism. Okay. The politics of justice and compassion. This is compared with the politics of oppression and exploitation. That's a little bit easier to understand, I think. Now, the tyrant depends on numbness of the populace to pull that off. The populace has to be numb to the plight of, say, migrants, or the plight of people without access to health care, or that sort of thing, right? So the politics of oppression and exploitation with this new society that Moses put together, that was replaced with the politics of justice and compassion. This was a break from that. So there were new laws. Moses brought a set of new laws down from Mount Sinai, new norms of right and wrong, new accountability. If you look at the Ten Commandments, there are more commandments dealing with how people should treat one another than how people should approach God. This was a new community to match God's freedom. We're talking about a free God. We are not talking about gods that were kept, that were imprisoned to serve the purpose of the tyrant. We're talking about a free God and a new society to match God's freedom, the freedom of this new God. And this is really a testimony to that both imperial religion and imperial politics can in fact be broken. Amazing. Here's the prophet giving hope and amazement following the criticism and the dismantling of imperial society. More about prophetic criticism. Let's look at, any questions first? We're going to go on to specific Bible passages that demonstrate how this went down, according to Exodus. But I better stop in case there are any questions so far about what I've said. Yeah.
When did this occur, like, BCE?
In history, in the historical timeline? Yeah. Okay. Well, just to put a stake in the ground, the kings of Israel, the King David was about, the kings of united Israel, Saul, David, and Solomon. King David was about 1000 BCE, okay, before Christ. This was about 250 years before that, the Exodus was, okay? So we're talking about, 1300 to 1200 BCE. That was the Exodus, and then the Israelites had lived in Egypt for about 400 years before that, right? We're talking about 400 years in Egypt up to the Exodus. Is that good enough? Yes. Yeah, okay, right. And I'll have to say that's all guesswork. I mean, nobody was writing history books at that time. Where this was all, and Exodus was written down hundreds of years after these events happened, right? So there's all a question of, are the details in Exodus even close to being right, because it was probably written down during the Babylonian exile, which was in the 6th century BCE, in the 500s BCE, and they're writing about events of the 1200 to 1300 BCE, okay? So, it's like 800 years later that these things were written down, okay? It was passed down by word of mouth. They were a storytelling people, people sitting around campfires saying, well, it happened this way. So yeah, that's the timeline that we think these things happened. So let's talk about some bookends, beginning and end of these events. At the beginning, the Egyptians are in full power, controlling everything. From Exodus 5. Let heavier work be laid on them, then they will pay attention to it and not to deceptive words. So the taskmasters and the supervisors of the people went out and said to the people, thus says the Pharaoh, an executive order of the time. So the executive order said, more work, put more work on them. Then they won't have time to think about it. But at the end, Egyptians are vanquished. From chapter 14. For the Egyptians whom you see today, you shall never see again. Thus the Lord saved Israel that day from the Egyptians, and Israel saw the Egyptians dead on the seashore. Those are the verses that bookended this whole story. So, what was the moment of dismantling? Let's zero in on that. It's the plague cycle. You've probably read about that, right? The 10 plagues. Now, interesting point. The first 2 plagues are matched by the Egyptian scientists, in quote. I probably should have used something like witch doctors or something like that. You know, they weren't scientists, but they claimed to be conjurers, or right? Well, the first 2 plagues are mad. The first plague was the Nile turned to blood. Second plague was frogs. So Aaron and Moses brought down these plagues from God. Strangely enough, the Egyptian witch doctors were able to match those plagues. They were able to. I think I've got this written down. Yeah, the empire is playing at anything you can do, I can do better. So they were able to duplicate it. But it didn't last long. Then comes the third plague. They couldn't do it. Aaron stretched out his hand with his staff and struck the dust of the earth, and gnats came on humans and animals alike. All the dust of the earth turned into gnats throughout the whole land of Egypt. The magicians tried to produce gnats by their secret arts, but they could not. The dominant culture has been shown to be fraudulent. Now, thus far, the Israelites were complaining to Pharaoh about how Pharaoh had been treated them, how Pharaoh had been treating them. But as this goes on, and the people saw that the Egyptians really could do nothing, the Israelites stopped complaining to Pharaoh and started complaining to God, because the Egyptians were useless. And in fact, after this event, it is now only a matter of time until the Egyptians are dead on the seashore. Now, let's talk about how this liberation began. The liberation begins with the grieving complaint of Israel. The Israelites groaned under their slavery and cried out. Their cry for help rose up to God from their slavery. God heard their groaning, and God remembered his covenant with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. God looked upon the Israelites, and God took notice of them. This covenant with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, that was back in Genesis. We're in Exodus now, but that covenant God made with their ancestors, you have to go back to Genesis to read about it. In the empire, we are pressed to pretend that things are all right. That's what the tyrant wants. It's part of becoming numb to the way things are. Pardon? Then or now? Yes, and. We're supposed to pretend. As long as the empire can keep the pretense alive that things are all right, there will be no real grieving and no real criticism, and therefore, no real liberation. The grieving of Israel is the beginning of criticism and therefore the beginning of liberation. That cry is acknowledged by Yahweh as history gathers power. Then the Lord said, I have observed the misery of my people who are in Egypt. I have heard their cry on account of their taskmasters. Indeed, I know their sufferings, and I have come down to deliver them from the Egyptians. The cry of the Israelites now has come to me. I have also seen how the Egyptians oppress them. Now go, I am sending you. This is the call to Moses. God has chosen Moses. Now, Moses pushes back. He says, I'm not a good public speaker, as he says essentially, and God pushes back at him and says, well, Aaron's a good speaker. You talk to Aaron, and Aaron will talk to the people. That's the way God solves the problem. I mentioned this already. By the middle of the plague cycle, Israel has disengaged from the empire, cries no more to it, expects nothing of it, acknowledges it in no way, and knows it cannot keep its promises. Criticism in the form of cry intensifies as the narrative develops. And at the end, it is the Egyptians who cry out. The tables have turned. Then there will be a loud cry throughout the whole land of Egypt, such as has never been or ever will be again. From chapter 11. Pharaoh arose in the night, he and all his officials and all the Egyptians, and there was a loud cry in Egypt, for there was not a house without someone dead. Both of these passages concerns the killing of the firstborn. This is the 10th plague. All of the Egyptian houses, both people and animals, the firstborn died, including the Pharaoh's firstborn son, who, of course, was set to take the throne after the current Pharaoh. The antidote was the blood of the lamb. All of the Israelites were supposed to slaughter a lamb and spread the blood around their doors, and God passed over the houses with blood over the doors, and that was the first Passover. The cry of Israel has become an empowering cry, but the cry of Egypt is one of dismantling helplessness. But it's too late. Now it does no good. The prophetic criticism has reached its goal. Anything about this prophetic criticism before we move on to prophetic energizing and hope? We may be able to learn something from this prophetic criticism. I don't know. We may be called to do some of that today against our empire, and I'm going to say more about today's situation coming up in a couple of minutes. I'm sorry? Couple of minutes. First point, Brueggemann makes 3 points about the energizing here that Moses engages in. First, energy can come from darkness, and this point, well, I'll just go on here. Energy can come from darkness, and here's the point he's making. But the Lord hardened the heart of Pharaoh, and he would not listen to them, just as the Lord had spoken to Moses. Chapter 9. There are similar passages in chapter 10 in a couple of places. But the Lord hardened Pharaoh's heart, and he would not let the Israelites go. Again, but the Lord hardened Pharaoh's heart, and he was unwilling to let them go. Now, these are puzzling passages. It's almost like God wanted this conflict to happen. The question is, why? Why wouldn't God allow Pharaoh the chance to be generous to Israel? Isn't that a puzzling question? God wanted this. It's almost like God wanted to make Egypt so difficult that God had an excuse to punish Egypt. Well, maybe God wanted a punishment for oppression and exploitation. I don't know. This is a difficult question to ponder. And in fact, Brueggemann says himself in his book, there is more here than can be understood. But whatever else it means, it begins in the conviction that God works on both sides of the street. That's from his book. I'm not going to try to say, if Brueggemann can't figure it out, I'm not going to try to tell you what it means. But it's something to think about. What was God after here to harden Pharaoh's heart? I'll just leave that as an exercise for the student. Second point, God does not flinch from taking sides. From Exodus 11, but not a dog shall growl at any of the Israelites, not at people, not at animals, so that you may know that the Lord makes a distinction between Egypt and Israel. God looks down at people who engage in oppression and exploitation of the poor and the marginalized. God doesn't like that. And God is not above taking sides when that happens. What an energizing statement. Moses takes sides with losers and powerless marginal people. I guess we shouldn't be afraid of doing the same thing, huh? God is for us. Now, on the other hand, in an empire with all of those gods, whether gods literally or one's ultimate concerns, no God is for anyone. Gods in an empire are imprisoned by the tyrant to do the tyrant's bidding, whatever that is. To use a modern example, the tyrant imprisons God to do his bidding by such things as waving Bibles around, maybe even selling Bibles on the internet, or demanding that the Ten Commandments be posted in public schools. That's using God for the tyrant's own purposes. So, God is for us. according to Brueggemann, and so the urging I make to those who would be prophets is that we do not neglect to do our work about who God is. We ought to know that. And that we know our discernment of God is at the breaking points in human community. That's when we really find out who God is. Now, prophetic energizing and hope. I want to talk about this hope that Moses brings to the people. 2 songs in Exodus 15, the Song of the Sea that Moses sings and the Song of Miriam. Of course, Miriam sings that. I'm going to talk about the Song of Miriam first, even though it comes second in chapter 15. I'll give her the reason for that in a minute. And Miriam sang to them, "Sing to the Lord, for he has triumphed gloriously. Horse and rider he has thrown into the sea." This celebrates the victory at the Red Sea. Now, the reason I talk about Miriam first is because Moses quotes the Song of Miriam in verse 1 of Moses' Song of the Sea. Now, the order makes it appear that Miriam is repeating the words of Moses, because the same words are in verse 1 as in verse 21. So the order makes it appear that Miriam, being quoted second, is repeating the words of Moses in verse 1, but it is likely that the opposite is true. For whatever reason, when this was written down, that author chose to put Miriam's song second, even though these words are probably original to Miriam. So I chose to talk about Miriam first. I'll say more about Miriam in a minute. Song of the Sea, Exodus 1 through 18. Much longer than the Song of Miriam, and I'm not going to quote the whole thing. I just want to quote 13 through 17 because this is a prediction rendered in past tense, if you can believe that. Again, an indication that this was written down hundreds of years later, so it's in the form of past tense, which it would be if it was written hundreds of years later. In your steadfast love, you led the people whom you redeemed. You guided them by your strength to your holy abode. That refers to the promised land. The peoples heard, they trembled, pangs seized the inhabitants of Philistia. These countries are the countries that the Israelites traveled through on the way to the promised land, and according to this, God made them tremble and fall down to let the Israelites pass through. Now, it didn't exactly happen that way, but these are the words of hope. Then the chiefs of Edom, Philistia are the lands of the Philistines, to the southwest of the promised land. Then the chiefs of Edom, land to the south of the promised land, were dismayed. Trembling seized the leaders of Moab, to the east of the promised land. And all the inhabitants of Canaan, that is the promised land, melted away. Terror and dread fell upon them. By the might of your arm they became still as a stone until your people, O Lord, passed by, until the people whom you acquired passed by. You brought them in and planted them on the mountain of your own possession, the place, O Lord, that you made your abode, the sanctuary, O Lord, that your hands have established. So this is a rendition of the easy journey to the promised land that they were about to undertake, rendered here in the past tense. It's strange, but there it is. But obviously words of hope. Third point, the energy of Moses' doxology. A doxology is a praise of the Lord. First, speaking of a new name that redefines all social perception. This is a replacing of the name Yahweh, the Lord, with all of the useless gods of the Egyptian empire. A new name. A review of an unlikely inversion of imperial reality nullified. The imperial reality is gone. An unlikely turning upside down of the social order and of the gods of Egypt being replaced by this new God of freedom. An asking for freedom in dance, free bodies that Pharaoh could no longer dominate. Here, I'm going to bring up Miriam again. Verse 20, then the prophet Miriam, Aaron's sister, took a tambourine in her hand, and all the women went out after her with tambourines and with dancing. Apparently they couldn't do that in Egypt, or they'd had no reason to, I guess. But Brueggemann mentions this with a look at the current context. I don't know anything about feminist theology. We ought to go next door and listen in on their class, I guess. But it's been my observation that tyrants often, one of their approaches is to oppress the freedom of women. And you can look for extreme examples in some Islamic societies, but even here in the West, you can see evidence of certain tyrants who shall remain nameless, putting restrictions on the freedom of women to do what they want with their own bodies. And it seems to be characteristic of tyrants to do that. Again, I don't know anything about feminist theology, but that seems to be par for the course. And here in their new free society, women go out with tambourines, singing and dancing as evidence of a new freedom in that society. I guess in a way, I see these recent restrictions as a sort of a canary in the coal mine. Are we increasingly living in an empire today? Are we increasingly living under a tyrant? We should be watching for signs like that. I don't know. It's something to be aware of, that there are signs like that, signs like the restrictions on women that might mean something that we need to be aware of. Another point about the energy, it's a culmination in enthronement that Egypt could not tolerate. Verse 18, the Lord will reign forever and ever. Now, implied in that is the Lord will reign forever and ever, and Pharaoh will not. Now, you can never get away with saying that in Egypt, but now they can. Are there things that we are no longer able to say? Well, there are artists and comedians today that can't get away with saying things. Maybe that's another canary in the coal mine that we should be watching. Bergman finishes out a chapter in his book talking about the Mosaic tradition, affirming three things. The alternative life is lived in this very particular historical and historicizing community. This had never happened before. This is a new way of living under a free God. This community criticizes and energizes by its special memories that embrace discontinuity and genuine breaks from imperial reality. This community, gathered around their memories, knows it is defined by and is at the disposal of a God who, as yet, is unco-opted and uncontained by the empire. Now, looking ahead, I'm going to use this as a jumping off point to say, join me next week, because we're going to see that this goes wrong over the next 250 years in Israel's history. Israel asks, at the time of Samuel, book of 1 Samuel, Israel asks for and is granted a king. Samuel is forced to anoint a king over Israel. And we'll see that through King Saul, King David, and particularly egregious King Solomon. And they're right back where they started in Egypt, except it's their own king who oppresses and exploits them. And then I'll get into the prophets, Jeremiah and Isaiah, who again announce a new freedom for the people. So, go in peace, serve the Lord.